Audio versus MIDI. Which should you use? I'm going to break down the pros and cons for both today to help you make better music. I've got some audio samples here, which are going to showcase what are the benefits to using audio files. The first one here is a drum loop. So if we open up our drum sample by double clicking on it, we've got a few settings here that you wouldn't find in the MIDI settings. We've got our warp function here, which if we select beats, transients, and this first arrow here, we can make the drum loop quite snappy, which is something you wouldn't be able to do with MIDI. I use this a lot if I'm putting this over the top of my drums just to add a little bit of texture. The reason this is so great on top of a drum loop already is you don't want it to overpower the drums by being so full. So by tightening it, it just adds to the groove. Next, we've got a vocal sample, which we're going to showcase the Complex Pro setting here. So if I play it currently on beats,
If I say goodbye, then make me.
You'll hear it's quite rigid and the BPM of the track is 110 and this vocal is at 128. But because it's a different pace, the vocal is struggling to get those transients out. So by enabling Complex Pro, you're going to make the transients a lot smoother because it's at a different BPM it needs this to be on.
If I say goodbye, then make me alive.
So for vocal samples, any synthesizer loops, anything that needs those smoother transients, if it's at a different speed of BPM, then I'll always have them on Complex Pro. You can also reverse the audio file by pressing the reverse button, which you wouldn't be able to do in MIDI. Another time I use audio files is for when I'm trying to speed up my process and I'm just throwing in a drum loop. So this is a shaker loop. So immediately you get something to add to the groove and you don't need to draw in the notes individually with MIDI. It saves a lot of time. There's also a fade function here. So if you can't see the fades, which is this thing here, it means you've got the automation tabs on. So just select this button up here and you'll start seeing the fades come in. This example, I've got a pad. I get to pull down this fade tab and it's going to come in a lot more naturally, like a string almost. To make it kind of swoosh up, rather than just being. Another awesome thing that audio lets us do is we can resample things. So this is really handy for getting creative with certain things. And also say I wanted to put this loop together. I was happy to consolidate it. I would go down, create an audio track by pressing Command T. I'd press resample here. I'd arm this, which is going to record it. And then I'm going to press record up here. And now I've got this whole loop in one individual audio file. So obviously with all those pros, there's going to be some cons about why I don't use audio files. For me personally, I like to use MIDI for drums because if I wanted to change this kick drum around, I've got to drag another sample in and then I've got to listen to it and then keep doing that one by one until I find the one that I like. And then you've got to duplicate everything over. So for me, that slows down the process a lot. And that's why I stick to using MIDI for drums. Also, if you notice, I've got 5 audio channels and only 3 MIDI channels. That's because you cannot layer sounds on audio files. You have to actually have a whole new channel designated for it. And so for me, that just creates more space when I could have everything in one. When I get down to the MIDI section, I'll show you what I mean by that specifically. So the pros of MIDI now, as the name suggests, musical instrument, it's an instrument. So it lets you play all these things, whether it's a sample, whether it's a synthesizer, with a piano or even a keyboard. Just your letters on the keyboard can be turned into an instrument as well. So if I just want to press the kick, I can do that. And say if I want to drag an instrument in, let's just say I've got the Juno. I've now got the world famous retro synthesizer, the Juno, at my fingertips. So without MIDI, we wouldn't be able to play these synthesizers. Another thing that is fantastic with MIDI is you get the MIDI effects. So I'm going to create a MIDI track here, and we're going to draw in a MIDI clip by pressing Shift Command M, or just right click and press Insert MIDI clip. And we're just going to draw a note. We'll draw a chord, and we're just going to throw something to trigger the sound. So I've got my instruments here. I've got a grand piano here. I'll drag that on top. Going to turn this up a bit. It's quite low, the piano. Now we've got these chords that I've just drawn into this MIDI clip. This is the piano roll. Now the MIDI effects. We go into MIDI effects just over to our left. First one off the bat, arpeggiator is fantastic. So I'm going to turn a chord into an arpeggiated sequence. So by double clicking on that, I'm getting a melody in itself just from me drawing in some chords. I can make that faster. And that's something that's really handy for beginners who aren't the best at creating melodies. Then we've got the chord MIDI effect, which is fantastic. I'm going to go in, I don't even need these top two notes anymore. I just need a single note. And if we go down to the presets chord, I like the fourth chord. All I have to do is press a note, and I've suddenly got a chord. So all I'm doing is pressing a signal note. You'll see it's a C, but it's playing a chord. So if I go maybe C, D. So another reason I love using MIDI for drums is the simplicity. So I've got a 909 kit here, which is a type of drum machine. I'm going to create a MIDI clip, and it's got all the sounds that come from that core kit. And I'll just program in a classic house loop so you can see how you can have a whole drum loop in the one channel. We go down here. This is our 909 core kit. Follow that. That's something you would never be able to do with audio. Have everything in the one channel, super clean, super easy to work with, and it's something that I like to do a bit. So the sample auditioning is something I mentioned before, that if I wanted to change this kick sample around for an audio file, it'd take a while and it's a bit tedious. If I've got this MIDI channel here for my kick, all I have to do is change this simpler down here. This is where the signal is coming from. So say I wanted to change that kick to something a bit more houseier, drag a kick in. And now I've got the entire kick drum changed in a matter of seconds. That's something that speeds up my process a lot, because I feel like a lot of people want to change samples around. They want to see if a different kick, different snare sounds better in the new track, and you don't want to have to go back and just copy and paste everything over again. We talked about drum layering before, and you notice that I've only got 3 channels here for the MIDI, and I've got 5 here for audio. That's because instead of having the 2 snares here in 2 different files, I've got 1 snare channel here, and I've got 2 different snares. Now, I created that by pressing Command Shift G, or right clicking and pressing Group. So this was the original snare that I had. It's got a lot more echo to it. It's got most of the tail that you hear. So that's just back to the simplicity again. I only want 1 channel for my snare. I've got 2 different snares on it. Just saves a lot of time at the end, just having less channels. What's awesome here too is it's even easier to mix in together. So say you've got 1 snare that's overpowering the other. You've got a volume fader here, which lets you adjust it, and you can just hear it. And that's super easy to just mix the 2 sounds together, the way you get 1 nice sounding snare. You've got a track pan here, which is I use a lot if I'm using a pad or a piano or something, and I want to have 1 piano to the left and 1 to the right. You've got the left and right here, and that way again you have this really fat sounding piano or chord, one to the left, one to the right, and it's all on the one channel. So if we go into the actual simpler itself, which is where the sound's getting triggered, we have a few settings here. You notice this one is in classic and then this one's in one shot. So the difference between one shot and classic mode is if it's in classic mode, you're only going to hear the sample play for as long as that note's played. So let's just say I drag this really short. I'm going to just play this one, which is in classic mode. It's really short and now it's long again. If I soloed this one, which is in one shot mode, it doesn't matter how short or how long the note is, it's going to play the entire thing. So just keep that in mind with the one shot, that if you have something like a snare, maybe a cymbal that you just want to have to draw once, you don't have to drag it all the way along, you can have it in one shot mode. But if you want something to be quite short and snappy, it's best to have it in classic, and then you can adjust the length yourself. So just like the snare with the shakers, I've got two different shaker samples playing in a drum rack, and to just get a drum rack, you go instruments, drum rack, and you can have samples wherever you want. You can have instruments too. If you want to have a synthesizer in there playing something too, you can. And then you go into your MIDI clip, and then you've got your samples that are there. And once again, you have two different shaker sounds in the one channel, rather than in audio, you're going to have two different shaker channels. In the simpler settings, we've got a few different things that are important to know. You've got a filter here, which is handy to have. You don't have to throw an auto filter in there. You've got a filter built into it. If you go into controls, there's a few more advanced settings, which we won't look into today too much, but we've got a pan again, just like left and right, same as before. And we've got a transpose, which is cool if you want to pitch the sample up or down. Now you might have noticed that there's the classic mode, one shot mode, and there's a slice. So that slices up your sample for you. Right now I've got it sliced by transient. This is really good because it's only going to slice the peaks in the audio, which is often the most important sounds. If I had acquired a track and I wanted to slice more frequently, I would slice by beat, and that's going to do it by every beat that I choose. So it's on quarter notes at the moment, and that's going to slice it throughout the track. You can see if I did it just by transient, it's only got so many transients that I can play. So it's not going to go through the entire sample. Now, why this is really cool is if I go on my keyboard, each of these transients that are sliced, I'm going to be able to press a note on the keyboard and it's going to select one of those notes to play it like an instrument. So I'll press a C. I'm just pressing random notes on the keyboard here. Now I've got individual one-shot synth sounds of an entire loop. So the classic loop just would be played like this. Go into slice mode, and now it's all sliced up into individual transients. I also like to use it with vocals to kind of get these vocal chops. So slice mode again, it's going to slice the transients. I'm just going to press notes on the keyboard again. And you're going to get these. And that's how you can slice up some samples. With vocals, it could be cool to do it in beat mode, so it plays for a bit longer. You see the width of the bars are a lot wider in the beat mode. So you can hear what she's actually saying a bit more. So another way you can turn a sample into your own instrument through MIDI is by throwing audio file of a sample into a MIDI channel, and it's going to put it into this simpler for us. And now if I start pressing the piano, I'm pressing C, so that's what the original sound sounds like. And if I start going up in notes, it'll start rising in pitch too. So that gives you the freedom that audio wouldn't, because now I can play it in all kinds of pitches on the keyboard. Something to be mindful of, if your sample doesn't say that it's in the key of C, you need to find out that it's playing a C, and I'll explain why. So if we go into audio effects, we're going to throw a tuner on. And now I'm going to press a C and hopefully a C is going to come up. Okay, so this one's in C. So that means if I press C on the keyboard, I'm going to get a C. If that was, say, getting a G sharp or something, and I press C, it's going to play the G sharp, but I'm going to be thinking it's playing C. So I'll give you an example. Here I've got a sample in the key of G sharp, which it tells me. and the tuner's telling me I've got G sharp 2. If I go into my piano roll, I'm pressing C at the moment. So yeah, I think I'm playing C, but actually it's G sharp. If, for example, you want it to stay in that key, what you can do is you can go simpler to sampler. And this is just a more advanced version of simpler. You put your root key, the G sharp, because that's what the sample is. And now when I press C, I'm going to get C. When I press D, I'm going to get D, and so forth. So just keep that in mind. When you're playing with one-shot samples, make sure that they're in C, just so when you're playing the keyboard, you're getting the same notes that you're touching. So something else I like to do if I'm using MIDI for my drums is to humanize it by changing the velocity. What I mean by this is I've got to close that here, and I'm going to create a MIDI clip, and I'm just going to draw in the type of notes my closed tap would usually be playing. This is quarter notes. Super robotic, doesn't sound like a human's playing it at all. Down here you've got velocity. That's going to determine how loud or how soft the note's going to be played. And as such, then it's going to give it a more human feel because every note's not hitting at the same exact volume. So by pressing Command, dragging down, or you can just drag down here or drag up there. I like to just have them at different volumes. You just notice the difference right off the bat there. First half, and then it's just straight again. So velocity is super important to add a bit of depth and to humanize it a bit. You don't want to sound too robotic all the time. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. So like the audio, there's lots of pros that come with using these, but there's going to be a downside. And for me, it's all about the visualization. So down here, I've got a pad. I've got the audio file and I've got the MIDI file, both playing the exact same thing. Look at the audio file. You can see the waves in it. You can see where it gets quieter, where it gets louder, and got the fade function, which I mentioned before, which is really nice to blend in the audio. And with the MIDI, it's just a single note. You have no idea what it's doing, and you can't see when it's ending and when it's getting quieter. And I think that's a really big thing. At the end of the day, though, everyone's going to find different things better for them. So what I would applaud you to do is try everything. Try them on drums, whether it's MIDI or audio. Instruments, try throw in audio tracks instead of just using MIDI files for your instruments, and just see what works for you best. Because at the end of the day, what works for me might not work for you. And a really good example of that is my teacher teaching me music production a few years ago. He religiously used audio files. And I remember thinking, well, if I want to be as good as him, or I want to make music like him, I better use all audio files. And for me, it was just so tedious having to do these loops like this, to drag samples all the way through again if I decided to change the kick drum or sample. That was something that slowed me down a lot. And for me, I like to just push on with my music and get it out kind of as quick as possible. So please experiment with what you like, what you don't like, and hopefully there's some things that you've taken today that you can experiment with. Thanks for staying to the end of the video. I hope you learned when and when not to use audio or MIDI files, and hopefully you can experiment yourself and find out what works for you. Please subscribe to my channel, and if you want to watch a video where I break down Ableton 12, then click here. Until then, I'll see you in the next one.